You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your PMP certification journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Negotiating project agreements means reaching clear, ethical commitments that enable delivery while protecting organizational value. Agreements take many forms: defining scope with a stakeholder, confirming acceptance criteria, setting milestone dates, aligning resources across departments, or working out contract terms with vendors. They also occur internally, such as reconciling priorities among cross-functional teams. The project manager's stance in these conversations should be that of a principled negotiator, focusing on underlying interests rather than rigid positions, and relying on data instead of pressure tactics. Governance and compliance must remain visible at all times. Even when urgency pushes for a quick deal, PMI expects agreements to be structured, transparent, and defensible. The importance of principled negotiation lies in sustainability. Agreements made under duress or without clarity often unravel, creating disputes and damaging trust. By contrast, agreements built on shared interests hold firm under stress because both sides see value in upholding them. For example, a vendor that negotiates fair terms tied to performance outcomes is more likely to support the project during difficulties. The PMP exam frequently embeds negotiation scenarios into situational questions. The correct choice usually reflects interest-based negotiation and emphasizes compliance and governance, rather than shortcuts or concessions made without analysis. Negotiation contexts are broader than formal contracts. Project managers negotiate daily over resources with functional managers, over backlog order with product owners, or over handoffs between teams. Agreements also appear in acceptance criteria, where stakeholders must decide what done looks like, or in scheduling discussions about dependencies. Because these moments are so common, PMI places negotiation squarely within the people domain. Success is measured not just by closing a deal, but by achieving alignment that supports project outcomes. The exam will often test your ability to recognize when negotiation is occurring, even if it is not labeled explicitly as such. Preparation is the cornerstone of effective negotiation. Before entering discussions, project managers should clarify objectives, constraints, and priorities, as well as identify non-negotiables that protect project integrity. Mapping stakeholder interests helps uncover potential trades areas, where one party values something highly while another sees it as less critical. Knowing your BATNA-best alternative to a negotiated agreement ensures you understand your fallback if talks fail. Estimating the other party's BATNA helps gauge leverage. Gathering data such as cost impacts, risk exposure, benefit trade-offs, and organizational precedents provides the evidence needed to make your case persuasively. On the exam, correct answers emphasize preparation over improvisation. Stakeholder mapping also surfaces interests that may not be obvious. For instance, a department head might resist a deadline not because they oppose the project, but because their team faces a competing initiative. Recognizing this interest allows the project manager to negotiate sequencing or resource sharing rather than treating the situation as pure opposition. Similarly, understanding the counterparty's BATNA helps avoid overconfidence or undue concession. If their alternatives are weak, you may have more room to negotiate favorable terms. If their alternatives are strong, you must be realistic about what can be achieved. The exam rewards candidates who identify and respect these dynamics. Data strengthens negotiation because it shifts discussion from subjective opinion to objective reality. Demonstrating how a resource request aligns with business value, or how a delay increases risk exposure, grounds the conversation in shared facts. Historical precedents also help. If similar projects have faced disputes over unclear acceptance criteria, you can argue for more precise definitions up front. Preparation also reduces surprises. Knowing your constraints means you can reject unreasonable requests without hesitation. On the exam, answers that emphasize evidence and analysis usually reflect PMI's philosophy, while distractors often rely on vague persuasion or pressure. Negotiation strategies vary, but integrative approaches generally outperform distributive ones. Integrative negotiation aims to, quote, grow the pie, finding trades that benefit both sides, while distributive negotiation splits a fixed pie, with one side's gain being the other's loss. Packaging issues together often unlocks opportunities. A team might concede on delivery sequence in exchange for additional testing support. Anchoring, a tactic where the first offer shapes the bargaining zone, can be effective but must be used carefully. Silence and thoughtful questions often achieve more than long speeches. On the exam, correct answers emphasize integrative strategies, testing assumptions, and resisting last-minute pressure traps. Time pressure is a classic negotiation tactic where one side pushes for quick agreement to exploit urgency. Skilled project managers recognize this and manage time carefully, refusing to concede simply because a deadline looms. Instead, they may pause to reframe priorities, propose interim agreements, or request more data. The PMP exam frequently includes scenarios where time pressure is present, and the correct answer usually resists hasty concessions. PMI's philosophy is that project managers protect long-term outcomes and governance, even under stress. Better a brief delay for clarity than a rushed deal that creates larger risks later. Clarity in terms is essential to sustainable agreements. Deliverables must be defined specifically, with acceptance criteria and measurement methods agreed upon. Change mechanisms are also critical. No project remains static, so parties must understand how changes will be proposed, analyzed, and approved. Dispute resolution paths provide safety valves, showing stakeholders that issues can be addressed without derailing progress. Aligning incentives to outcomes rather than just outputs ensures everyone remains motivated toward value creation. On the exam, distractors often involve vague agreements. The correct answer emphasizes clarity, structure, and visibility in terms. Documentation reinforces clarity. Every agreement should be captured in decision logs, contracts, or working agreements, depending on context. Documenting rationale is equally important, as it creates a traceable record for governance and lessons learned. This prevents disputes later, where parties may recall commitments differently. Transparency builds confidence, particularly across cross-functional or vendor relationships. The PMP exam reflects this by embedding scenarios where handshake deals without documentation cause conflict. The correct answer usually emphasizes documenting agreements visibly and aligning them with artifacts the organization expects. Ethics and professionalism anchor all negotiation. Fairness, honesty, and respect ensure agreements are sustainable and relationships preserved. Hidden commitments or bait-and-switch tactics may secure short-term wins, but damage credibility and trust. Professionalism requires disclosing constraints that materially affect feasibility, such as budget ceilings or regulatory requirements. Cultural differences may shape style. Some stakeholders value direct confrontation, others prefer consensus, but the project manager holds to substance while respecting style differences. On the exam, PMI consistently rewards ethical conduct over tactical advantage. The correct choice is rarely the one that secures victory at the expense of fairness. Recording rationale for decisions serves both ethical and practical purposes. Traceability demonstrates that agreements were made thoughtfully and with appropriate consideration of constraints. It also strengthens governance by providing a record for audits or reviews. For example, documenting why a specific vendor was chosen based on risk-sharing terms protects against accusations of bias later. The PMP exam often frames such scenarios in compliance-heavy context, and the correct answer is always to preserve documentation and transparency rather than relying on informal memory. Respecting cultural differences in negotiation style improves outcomes. Some cultures prefer detailed written contracts, while others lean heavily on relationships and verbal commitments. Project managers must navigate these differences carefully, ensuring substance is not sacrificed but style is adapted for respect. For example, providing detailed written agreements while also maintaining relational trust meetings satisfies both preferences. On the exam, correct answers often involve balancing respect for cultural norms with insistence on governance and clarity. PMI emphasizes that respect does not mean compromise on integrity. In conclusion, negotiation in project management is about building agreements that are clear, fair, and aligned to outcomes. Preparation involves clarifying objectives, mapping interests, and knowing both your BATNA and the counterparties. Strategies favor integrative approaches, packaging issues, and resisting time pressure. Clarity in terms, supported by documentation, ensures sustainability. Ethics, fairness, and cultural respect protect trust and long-term collaboration. On the PMP exam, scenarios involving negotiation reward candidates who emphasize preparation, clarity, ethics, and governance. Negotiation is not about winning at all costs, but about securing agreements that enable delivery and protect value. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Negotiation in agile environments often looks different than in predictive ones, but the principles remain consistent. In agile, negotiation centers on backlog ordering, service levels, and agreeing to definitions of done or ready. These agreements determine what work is prioritized and when it is acceptable for release. Predictive projects, by contrast, focus more on negotiating baselines, milestones, and contract terms. Here, agreements are often formalized in documents reviewed by governance bodies. Hybrid contexts combine both, requiring backlog and cadence-based discussions with formal milestone reviews. On the PMP exam, clues in the scenario will point to the delivery mode. The correct answer will show negotiation aligned to the artifacts and cadence of that method. Visibility is critical in all modes. In Agile, agreements must be reflected in updated backlogs, visible to the whole team. Predictive agreements should be captured in updated baselines, change logs, or contracts. Hybrid approaches require cross-translation. For example, an agreement on backlog prioritization must be presented at governance checkpoints as baseline adjustments. The PMP exam often tests whether candidates make agreements visible in the artifacts expected by the delivery context. Correct answers highlight that agreements do not remain verbal or hidden but are documented and accessible to stakeholders. Vendor contracts are one of the most formal negotiation contexts. The type of contract chosen influences how risk and responsibility are shared. Time and materials contracts allow flexibility but place cost risk on the buyer. Fixed-price contracts shift risk to the vendor but require precise scoping. Cost-reimbursable contracts offer flexibility with oversight but demand strong governance. Beyond type, negotiations must establish incentives and penalties tied to outcomes, not just outputs. For example, rewarding early delivery is only valuable if quality and adoption are sustained. On the exam, correct answers often emphasize aligning contract incentives with business outcomes, not just raw volume or activity. Risk sharing is an important dimension of vendor negotiation. If risks are unfairly shifted to one side, the relationship becomes brittle. Balanced incentives and penalties encourage both parties to collaborate through difficulties rather than adopt defensive postures. Change control mechanisms must also be clearly defined, as most disputes stem from ambiguous processes for handling changes across organizational boundaries. The PMP exam frequently includes vendor disputes in its scenarios. The correct answer usually involves formalizing agreements through change control policies, ensuring disputes are prevented through clarity up front rather than fought after the fact. Claims prevention highlights PMI's philosophy that clarity now beats disputes later. A well-structured contract includes explicit acceptance criteria, service-level agreements, and escalation paths. It also defines documentation and reporting expectations. These provisions prevent misunderstandings and provide evidence if disputes arise. A project manager who negotiates these terms up front reduces risk of litigation or costly conflict later. On the exam, distractors may suggest ignoring details for speed. The correct answer will emphasize detailed clarity in agreements, protecting both delivery and relationships over the project's lifespan. Consider a scenario where a vendor requests a minor change, claiming it has no cost or schedule impact. Options might include approving the change verbally, demanding impact analysis with a formal amendment, escalating directly to the sponsor, or ignoring the request. The best next action is to request analysis and then amend the contract formally, followed by updating baselines and artifacts. This ensures transparency and prevents scope creep disguised as minor adjustments. On the exam, any answer that accepts handshake deals without documentation is typically incorrect. PMI emphasizes that even minor changes must follow structured processes. Translating this scenario into an agile context highlights how agreements shift in form but not intent. Instead of a formal contract amendment, a supplier's request for change would be reflected in the working agreement or backlog policy. The product owner, supported by the team, would determine whether the change affects priorities. Documenting the decision in the backlog ensures transparency and alignment. On the exam, clues like supplier in sprint delivery point toward agile processes. The correct answer involves updating working agreements or backlog, not treating it as a predictive-style contract amendment. Exam pitfalls in negotiation questions often revolve around informality or short-term thinking. Handshake deals without documentation create ambiguity and risk. Conceding without understanding stakeholder interests or your BATNA undermines your position and may result in unsustainable agreements. Incentives misaligned to value, such as paying a vendor for volume of work completed rather than adoption outcomes, encourage the wrong behaviors. Finally, skipping change mechanisms or rebaselining first violates governance. On the exam, these pitfalls are common distractors. Correct answers always emphasize documentation, clarity, alignment to outcomes, and adherence to governance processes. Documentation cannot be overstated. Agreements made casually, without logs or traceability, become breeding grounds for disputes. PMI expects project managers to treat every agreement, however minor, as part of governance. This means decision logs, change requests, baseline updates, or backlog adjustments, depending on context. The PMP exam tests this rigor by presenting scenarios where informality appears tempting. The correct answer always requires documentation. Governance and transparency remain central, even when pressure to move quickly is high. A quick playbook summarizes best practices for negotiating project agreements. Step 1. Prepare by clarifying interests, gathering data, and knowing your BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and ZOPA, Zone of Possible Agreement. Step 2. Negotiate ethically, aiming for clarity in deliverables, acceptance criteria, change paths, and escalation mechanisms. Step 3. Align incentives to outcomes, ensuring agreements support long-term value rather than short-term activity. Step 4. Document everything, maintaining visible governance and traceability. On the PMP exam, answers that mirror this playbook consistently reflect PMI's philosophy of principled, structured, and transparent negotiation. Preparation is particularly critical. Without understanding your BATNA and the ZOPA, the range where agreements are possible, you risk entering discussions blind. PMI expects project managers to anticipate counterparty interests, prepare fallback options, and propose trades that grow the pie rather than divide it. On the exam, distractors often reflect a lack of preparation, such as conceding quickly or escalating without attempting negotiation. Correct answers typically highlight preparation, interest-based trade-offs, and structured documentation. Ethics closes the loop on negotiation. Even when under pressure, project managers must act with fairness, honesty, and respect. hidden commitments or withholding critical constraints erodes trust and creates fragile agreements. Transparency builds credibility, which often matters as much as the terms themselves. The PMP exam consistently rewards candidates who hold ethical anchors front and center. The correct answer rarely involves shortcuts. It emphasizes principled negotiation, governance, and sustainable agreements. Effective negotiators enable delivery, protect value, and preserve trust all at once. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.